The Great War is over. Europe is pretty much trashed. There are many Europeans that really just kind of wanted a new place to live. So naturally they came to the United States. But what happened when they got here? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today's video is titled Reds, Anarchists, and Immigrants. After the Great War, a lot of Europeans really needed a new place to live, so they immigrated to the United States. And they brought a lot of interesting ideas along with them. But what happened in the 1920s when those ideas kind of clashed with our own American ideas? The question we're going to try to answer today is, how did Americans react to perceived threats to their way of life? Grab your pencil and paper and take some good notes, and by the end of this video, hopefully you'll have an answer to that question. The first thing we got to talk about is the Red Scare. In the beginning of the 1920s, Americans were incredibly fearful that communism would come over here to America and kind of sweep over and take charge. A lot of Americans believe that, hey, it happened over there and nobody really expected it to. What's to stop it from happening over here? Essentially what happened with the communist takeover in Russia was that the little guys kind of felt incredibly beat down by the rich upper class, and eventually they had enough and they rose up and overthrew that rich upper class. A lot of Americans were pretty fearful that that could easily happen here in the United States because we had an incredibly large lower economic class and not very many upper economic people. The thing that was going on in the 1920s though is the economy was doing well, and people, even the lower economic class people, were starting to see an upturn, and they really didn't want any kind of interruption to that. There was also a huge fear of what was called the anarchy movement. Anarchy is when you oppose any form of government. A lot of Europeans, especially Eastern Europeans, were not so happy with governments. It was the governments that caused the First World War. Governments were in all sorts of turmoil in the 1920s in Europe, and a lot of people kind of had this idea that the only thing that governments do is screw things up, so we ought to just get rid of them altogether. A lot of people feared that as more and more people left Europe and came to the United States post-Great War, that they would bring this idea with them and it would cause problems here in the United States. Again, in the 1920s, things are looking good for us. We're on an upturn and we don't want any kind of disruption. As far as this Red Scare thing goes, really and truly at the heart of it was immigrants. Immigrants were the target of people that were afraid during this Red Scare. A lot of that fear of immigrants is thanks to these two guys right here, Mitchell A. Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover. Mitchell Palmer was the U.S. Attorney General, and J. Edgar Hoover was kind of an up-and-coming political figure that was all about law enforcement. Both men were incredibly prominent in what have been called the Palmer Raids. Essentially what happened in early 1920 is somebody decided to send a mail bomb to Mitchell Palmer's house, and half his house got blown up. Now luckily Palmer and his family were fine. They were in the back half of the house. The front half of the house was the part that got exploded. Because of this, Palmer really stirred up a lot of fear against immigrants. Turns out it was an immigrant anarchist who sent a mail bomb that took down half of Palmer's house. So Palmer goes on this big rant against immigrants in general and how they're bringing all sorts of very harmful ideas with them when they come to the United States, and because of that we should probably get rid of as many of them as we possibly can. A guy named J. Edgar Hoover, who coincidentally would later on become the first director of the FBI. So what happens in these Palmer raids? Well, essentially Palmer gets J. Edgar Hoover to go around and raid all sorts of what they considered radical immigrants. A lot of these radical immigrants get arrested. A lot of them get deported, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 6,000, mostly for absolutely nothing. A lot of the people that are affected by these raids are never found guilty or even really truly arrested for anything. They basically just get kicked out of the country because they're immigrants from undesirable areas of the world. Another reaction to this Red Scare, or incredible fear of immigrants that happens in the 1920s, is that the United States decides to place quotas on the number of immigrants that can actually come into the United States. Two laws in particular do this. One is the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This happens just after the Palmer raids. The other is the Immigration Act of 1924. Both laws limit the number of people that can immigrate from any given country in the world. If it happens to be a country that the United States is relatively friendly with and we don't see much problem with, say, I don't know, a place like Great Britain or France, they get an incredibly high quota number. But if it's an area of the world that has caused the United States some sort of trouble, I don't know, like maybe an Eastern European country or one of those places that was involved in the Great War, say like Germany or Hungary or one of those places, they are only allowed a very small number of immigrants. This was kind of designed to cap or put a limit on how much of this communism talk could come up, or how many anarchists could immigrate to the United States. The idea was that we don't want any of that trouble coming across the Atlantic and landing here. This idea of the Red Scare kind of comes to a head with these two guys right here, Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They wind up being involved in a trial that kind of shows just how fearful the United States was of immigrants and ideas like communism and anarchy. So who are Sacco and Vanzetti, and what exactly did they do? Both guys were Italian immigrants. They came to the United States not long after the Great War was over with. They were also very vocal anarchists. They weren't happy with any kind of government. Again, they believed that the government just screwed things up, so we should just get rid of it. What happens is they both get accused of murder. They actually are convicted of murder. The problem is there is very, very little evidence against them whatsoever. In fact, a lot of people say there's absolutely zero evidence against them. The only reason they were kind of singled out is because they were immigrants and they were vocal anarchists. Both are found guilty because of their ethnicity and their politics, essentially. And both wind up getting executed in 1927. This does not set well with the rest of the world. The rest of the world gets pretty hateful with the United States because of these guys' execution with little, or in all reality, probably no evidence. Their execution kind of opens America's eyes to kind of how crazy things had gotten during the Red Scare. Other countries had basically been kind of telling us, shame on you, America, for doing this. And people finally start to realize that in reality, it's only an incredibly small number of people that are really even talking about things like communism or anarchy. And for the most part, it's all talk, and nobody's really doing anything to actively push these ideas. And after their execution in 1927, the Red Scare slowly kind of dies down. By 1927, America's economy is just absolutely rolling on, doing fantastic. And it looks like things are going to be great for America. We're in an economic boom. People have money. People are happy. And the idea of the Red Scare kind of dies out after this incident. All right. What do you really need to take away from this video? Well, number one was that there was a widespread fear of communism and anarchy spreading through the United States at the beginning and throughout the 1920s. Number two, the U.S. really tried to limit immigration and prevent anything bad from happening. And last, number three, remember that Sacco and Vanzetti, they really got the shaft, mostly because they were immigrants in the wrong place at the wrong time. There you go, guys. Reds, Anarchists, and Immigrants. Hopefully you got good notes. Hopefully you're going to be ready for the quiz when it happens in class. And as always, remember, don't stop learning.